guys, in this video we're going to talk about ACE History Paper 2, Question A. We're going to start out with a little bit of information about Paper 2 and then go into detail about Question A. We're specifically going to discuss the rubric and the formatting, and we're going to finish up with a few tips and things you should do to make sure you're getting the most possible points for your Question A for your Paper 2. Paper 2 for your AS level history exams is where you get the most points. In general, on the AS level history exams, you can get a total of 100 points when you combine your Paper 1 and your Paper 2. Paper 1 is worth 40 points, Paper 2 is worth 60 points. Like Paper 1, you have to answer questions A and B for Paper 2, however, that's really where the similarities end. Because, unlike Paper 1, you have to answer 2 question A's and 2 question B's. Question A's are worth 10 points each, so you can get a total of 20 points for answering your A level questions, and B's are worth 20 points each, so a total of 40 points for the B questions. Now, when you get there on test day and you get to the test book, it's important to pay attention to the questions themselves, because a lot of students just flip open the book and start answering questions, which can become a little bit tricky here depending on which option you're taking. The European option, if you're taking that one, is questions 1 through 4. If you're taking the American option, you need to turn the next page and answer questions 5, 6, 7, or 8. And for the international option, you're the last 4 questions, questions 9 through 12. So don't just jump in and answer question 1. If you're taking the American option, you need to jump to question 5 and focus on questions 5 through 8. And that brings me to the next point. So let's go ahead and take a look actually at an example from a former Paper 2 test here. If you look at it here and you sit down, you get the American option here, 5, 6, 7, and 8. You need to answer 2 questions. You need to pick question 5, 6, 7, or 8. Pick 2 of those that you want to answer. So a lot of times, a lot of students will pick 2 chapters and really study them really well, knowing when they sit down on test day that, for example, they're going to answer the Civil War option and the Great Depression option. That's one strategy you can use. However, that's tricky because if you get there and you've only studied those 2 chapters and you get a question that you're not really prepared for, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot, because you have to answer both parts of 2 questions. You can't just pick and say, I like option A for 5 and A for 6, but I like the B options for questions 7 and 8, so I'm going to answer those. You cannot do that. You need to pick 2 questions and answer both parts of those 2 questions. So I would kind of recommend here, if you want to do the really study 2 chapters, that's fine, but look over the 3rd chapter of your choosing to make sure that you're really hammering it in. Now let's go ahead and take a look at what the topics are depending on which option you're taking. Let's say you're taking the European option. Your topics of interest here that you need to be studying and know information on are France from 1789 to 1814, the Industrial Revolution circa 1800 to 1890, origins of World War I circa 1900 to 1914, the Russian Revolution 1894 to 1917. So those are your options if you're taking the European part of the test. If you're focused on American history, your 4 topic areas are the expansion of U.S. power 1840s to the 1930s, the Civil War and Reconstruction, the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, and the Great Crash and the Great Depression. And finally, if you're doing the international option, your topics here are all international relations except for the last one. And now what you're really focusing on here is the years and what's happening in those years. So it's from 1871 to 1918, from about 1919 to 1933, from 1933 to about 1939. And finally, the last one is China and Japan from around 1919 to 1945. So those are your options in the areas that you really need to be studying and that your teacher should be preparing you for your Paper 2. The great thing about ACE History Paper 2 Question A is that you're always going to be doing the same thing, and that is explaining the causes of an event. Regardless if you're taking the European, American, or international options, for Question A, you're going to be given some event from whatever the main topic is that you're focusing on and having to explain the causes of that event. Let's go ahead and take a look at some examples from each one of the options here. So, for European, one of the past questions was to explain why the Industrial Revolution affected the standard of living. So very clearly here, you're explaining why. So you're giving the causes for the Industrial Revolution's effect on the standard of living. Why did the standard of living get affected by the Industrial Revolution? That's what you have to explain there. So your American option here is explain why the Prohibition movement gained increased support in the early 20th century. So you're saying what caused the Prohibition movement to get support in the early 20th century? What happened during the early 20th century that helped propel the momentum of the Prohibition movement? And if you're in the international option, one of the past questions was, why were the Boers in conflict with Britain between 1880 and 1902? So you can tell there by the wordings of the questions that it's always going to be a cause. You're explaining the causes for the event. So make sure you're reading carefully, linking up the information there, because if you look at the American example that we gave of explaining why the Prohibition movement gained momentum in the early 20th century, you need to make sure that your answers for your causation are focused on the early 20th century. Don't give anything from the 19th century. You have to focus on what happened in the 20th century. So make sure you're reading it carefully. But in general, that's all it is. You're just explaining causes. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the rubric to make sure that you're getting all the points and make sure you pass your question A. Here's the rubric for your question A for your paper 2. As you can see here, it goes from level 0 all the way up to level 4. That's just like on paper 1 for question A, also only went up to level 4. Like all the other AICE history papers, though, level 3 is your minimum target range here because that's where you can get into the passing range. But let's go ahead and go over each one of the levels here for you. So level 0, basically you wrote garbage, you didn't write anything at all, and you get 0 points for that. Level 1 is you're basically describing the topic or the issue. So if we look back at the examples from earlier, if you're talking about prohibition, you might in general explain what prohibition was without thoroughly actually answering the question, or you're just very generalized without giving very much information here. But so if you do that, they'll still give you a couple points, and you can get from about 1 to 2 at maximum. Well, moving on to level 2, this is describing factors and it's worth 3 to 5 points. Here it says answers show some knowledge and understanding of the demands of the questions. Answers are either entirely descriptive in approach with few explicit links to the question, or they provide some explanation which is supported by information which is limited in range in depth. So basically, you might know some of the causes of the event in question, but you're not really linking them and thoroughly explaining that you really know what you're talking about. Here, you're clearly haven't studied enough, you don't have a real grasp on how to thoroughly explain the actual link between the event in question and what caused it. So that will only get you level 2, but here you are showing that you know a little bit about the topic, but you're not to the depth needed to actually pass the question or to teach it, for instance, to somebody. Moving on up to the passing range here. Passing range can get you anywhere from 6 to 10 points depending on whether you have a level 3 or a level 4. Here's whenever you can look at the difference in the wording here. Level 3, you're explaining the factors, whereas level 4, you're actually really evaluating them. So let's go ahead and take a look at each one individually here. Your level 3, to get a level 3, you need to give 2 well-explained causes. So you have the event in question, and you come up with 2 causes for the event in question, and you thoroughly explain how those causes impacted the event in the question, or how they actually caused the event in the question. Remember here, you need to give specific, detailed information on regarding how what you are describing contributed to the event in the prompt. So you're really linking your causes to the events in the prompt and explaining how they caused it. Now, to get up to the level 4 range, you have to do everything you did in level 3. So you're still explaining those 2 causes, but you have to add the analysis of what cause is the most important and why. So whenever you've got those 2 causes listed, actually state whatever was the most important cause of the event in question, and explain in another paragraph why that one cause was the most important, why it was more significant than any other potential cause or the other cause that you listed. So you're really, I guess, sort of ranking the causes here, what's more significant and what's more important. And that's the gist of the rubric. Now let's take a look at formatting. Formatting for your question A's is very, very basic. You need 3 paragraphs here. Your first paragraph is always going to be what you have determined to be the most important cause in the event. Remember, you don't have to be right here. You just have to support your answers. So explain what the cause is, describe the cause for the event, and then provide evidence to why that cause or why that was a cause for the events and the prompt. And then you're going to do that for another paragraph. You're going to come up with another cause. So for your second paragraph, explain why another event was a cause for what happened in the prompt. Provide specific details describing that cause, and then provide the evidence of how that caused the events in the prompt. And then you come to your third paragraph. Your third paragraph is really where you get to the level 4. If you do the first 2 paragraphs here, you're in level 3. The third paragraph is where you jump into that level 4 range. And for your third paragraph, you need to explain why the cause in paragraph 1 was the most important cause for the event in the prompt. So here you're not just explaining that it was a cause, you're stating why your cause in your first paragraph was more significant than any other cause. How did it contribute the most to the event in the prompt? And that's where you're really getting that thoroughly evaluating the factors here, which is what they're looking for to get to level 4. So quick recap, 3 paragraphs. First paragraph would be what you think is the most important cause, describe the cause, link it back to the event in the prompt, do that with the second cause for your second paragraph, and then wrap it up with evaluating why your cause in paragraph 1 was the most important cause for the events in the prompt. All right, now let's wrap up with some final tips and some things to remember here for whenever you're actually sitting down and answering your question A's on that test day. First, if you are sitting there and you're looking at it thinking, I have so many causes for this event. Well, if you can categorize them, do it. What I mean there is group them by their category. If you have a ton of economic causes for an event, talk about them as a group of economic causes. And then if you have other political causes, talk about them together. So if you're talking about the causes of the Great Depression, you could talk about the economic causes for it and also the political causes for it in a separate paragraph altogether. Remember here that you only have an hour and a half to answer paper 2. So with question A's being your shorter responses and also the ones that are with less points, you need to make sure you're budgeting your time wisely. I would say 15 minutes per question A. That includes reading the question, planning it out, and actually writing a response to it. 15 minutes per question. So if you do that for both your question A's, that will have taken up 30 minutes of your hour and a half, giving you an hour to answer your question B's. And then next tip would be to study, study, study. There are no sources here to make it easier for you to pull information out. You have to know what you're talking about in order to pass this, which means you have to study. So like I said, a lot of students pick 2 chapters or 2 topics to really study in depth and to make sure they have like the back of their hand. However, I might also suggest you really kind of want to really look at that third one as well, at least kind of give it a good glance over a couple times, because you might get there on test day and one of those topics that you studied gives you a question that you really aren't prepared for, and then you can potentially bomb out your test. But hopefully you've done, if that's actually happens, hopefully for the other 3 questions you have to answer for your paper 2, that you did enough that it's not going to really hurt you, at least for as far as passing goes. Maybe you won't get that A on your AS level history test. Maybe you only get a C, but hey, that's passing. As some students say, E's get degrees. Please don't shoot for an E. Please shoot for higher than an E. And finally, one really big important tip here that I was actually given when I went to a Cambridge training was to actually do your planning in your answer book. What Cambridge does is they scan your answer book. So every single word you write in your response books gets sent to the scorers, and they say they read every single word. So if you've run out of time, or if you've kind of rambled and they can't really tell what you're talking about, the person who was leading the training I was at has said that they will go back and look at your planning, if it's in the book, to see if they can have an idea of where you're getting at. They actually look for you to be able to get points. They try to find points for you. They're not just nickel and diming you on points. They really want you to pass these things, but you have to prove it. And somehow you can actually prove it with your planning if you plan well. Also, another idea, I don't have it written down here, but you can also look at, if you're running out of time, bullet point. Just start jotting down the facts real quick. Write it down. If you're in that last minute, jot down everything you know really quickly. Forget the sentence format or whatever. Just quickly dot it out and bullet point. And like I said with paper 1, don't forget, no introductory paragraphs. No introductory paragraphs. Get right to the point. AICE History does not do introductory paragraphs or introductory statements. Just start writing. That's all they care about. They're not looking for fancy language conventions or things that you learned about in your English class. You can somewhat forget those while you're sitting down and actually answering your AICE History papers. So that is your AICE History Paper 2 Question A's. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. Thank you for watching.